The hammer hadn't even fallen when the laughter started. Cordelia Whitmore stood in the dusty auction yard, her weathered hands clutching a crumpled $20 bill, while 300 spectators erupted in cruel amusement. The horse before her was a pitiful sight. Matted coat caked with mud and neglect, ribs showing through patchy fur, and eyes that held more pain than a creature should ever know. The auctioneer, Brantley McCormick, barely bothered to hide his smirk as he gestured toward the pathetic animal. "Going once for $20 to the little lady in the back," he drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Anyone else want to throw their money away on this sorry excuse for a horse?" The crowd's laughter grew louder. Cordelia could hear the whispers cutting through the autumn air like razor blades. "What's that old woman thinking? That nag ain't worth the bullet it'd take to put it down. $20 for that thing? She's lost her mind." Standing beside his pristine white pickup truck, cattle baron Beauregard Ashworth III adjusted his 10-gallon hat and let out a booming laugh that silenced the crowd momentarily. "McCormick, you sure that animal's even breathing? Looks more like buzzard bait to me." His cronies, wealthy ranchers who controlled most of the county's land, chuckled appreciatively at their leader's wit. Cordelia felt every eye in the auction yard boring into her back. At 62, she'd endured plenty of mockery in her lifetime. But this felt different, more vicious. These weren't just strangers laughing at an eccentric old woman. They were people who'd watched her lose everything over the past 5 years. Her husband's death, the bank foreclosure on their ranch, her daughter's rejection when she'd needed family most. To them, she represented failure, and her desperate bid on this broken-down horse was just another chapter in her sad story. $20 going twice, McCormick announced, clearly enjoying the spectacle. "Last chance for anyone with sense to save this poor creature from whatever fate awaits it." The horse shifted slightly, its legs trembling with the effort of standing. For just a moment, its dark eyes met Cordelia's across the crowded yard. In that gaze, she saw something that made her heart skip. Not the defeat she expected, but a flicker of recognition, of hope, of something deeper that she couldn't quite name. Ashworth stepped forward, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. "Tell you what, McCormick, I'll do the Christian thing here and bid $50. Put the poor beast out of its misery proper-like instead of letting it suffer under—" He paused, his cold blue eyes finding Cordelia's face. Questionable care. The crowd murmured approval. $50 from a man worth millions was pocket change, but it represented a fortune to Cordelia, who'd been living in a converted storage. She'd since losing her home. She felt her resolve wavering as the reality of her situation crashed down. What was she thinking? She could barely feed herself, let alone care for a horse that looked half dead already. But then the horse did something extraordinary. It turned its head fully toward her, and despite the distance between them, despite its obvious pain and weakness, it took 3 deliberate steps in her direction. The crowd fell silent, sensing something unusual in the animal's behavior. $75. Cordelia called out, her voice stronger than she felt. The laughter returned, twice as loud as before. $100, Ashworth countered without hesitation, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. "This is getting ridiculous, McCormick. End this charade." But Cordelia had seen something in that horse's eyes, a spark of defiance that matched her own. Every dollar in her possession amounted to exactly $93.47, scraped together from cleaning houses and selling her late husband's tools. It should have been enough to buy groceries for 2 weeks, but standing there in the swirling dust, watching this magnificent creature refuse to give up despite everything it had endured, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. $150, she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet auction yard. The crowd's laughter died completely. This was no longer amusing. It was disturbing. Murmurs of concern rippled through the spectators as they realized the old woman was serious. Ashworth's face darkened, his jaw clenching as he processed the unexpected challenge to his authority. Percival Hawthorne, the auction yard's owner, leaned over to whisper urgently in McCormick's ear. Cordelia caught fragments of their conversation. "I doesn't have that kind of money." Embarrassing. Stop this before. But before McCormick could intervene, something remarkable happened. The horse, which had been standing with its head hanging low, suddenly straightened. Its ears pricked forward, and despite its weakened condition, it let out a clear, strong whinny that echoed across the yard. Then, to everyone's astonishment, it began walking directly toward Cordelia. The crowd parted instinctively as the animal approached. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, as if the horse had finally found what it had been searching for. Cordelia remained perfectly still, her heart pounding as this broken, beautiful creature drew closer. "What in the Sam Hill?" McCormick muttered, his auctioneer's patter completely forgotten. When the horse reached the auction yard's perimeter fence, it stopped just 2 feet from where Cordelia stood. Then, in a moment that would be talked about in the county for decades to come, the animal slowly, gracefully, lowered its great head until it was nearly touching the ground. It was a bow, unmistakable, deliberate, and profound. A collective gasp arose from the crowd. Ashworth's face had gone pale beneath his tan, and his cronies shifted uncomfortably, suddenly unsure of themselves. This wasn't in the script. Horses didn't bow to people, especially not half-dead auction horses to impoverished old women. Cordelia reached through the fence rails with trembling fingers and gently touched the horse's neck. At her touch, the animal raised its head and pressed its muzzle against her palm. She could feel its warm breath, could see the intelligence burning in its dark eyes, and in that moment, she understood something fundamental. This wasn't just a horse. This was a partner, a kindred spirit who had been waiting for her just as desperately as she'd been waiting for him. $200. Ashworth's voice cut through the silence like a whip crack. His face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. 250, 300, whatever it takes. But McCormick was staring at the horse and the old woman in fascination, his experienced eye recognizing something extraordinary when he saw it. He'd been running auctions for 30 years and had never witnessed anything like this. "The bid stands at 150, he said slowly, ignoring Hawthorne's frantic gestures. "Going once." Cordelia closed her eyes, knowing she was about to make a promise she had no idea how to keep. But the horse's gentle presence gave her strength. "Going twice." The silence stretched like a held breath. "Sold to the lady for $150. The paperwork should have been impossible." Cordelia stood in the auction office, her hand shaking as she signed documents she couldn't afford, for a horse she couldn't house with money she didn't have. But Marigold Pemberton, the auction company's bookkeeper, had quietly agreed to accept $50 as a down payment, with the balance to be paid within 30 days. "Don't know why I'm doing this," Marigold muttered, her weathered face softening, as she watched Cordelia through the window. The old woman was standing beside the horse trailer she'd somehow arranged to borrow, gently stroking the animal's neck, while it stood with remarkable patience. 30 years I've been working these auctions, and I ain't never seen anything like what happened out there." Outside, Ashworth was holding court with his associates, his voice carrying on the evening breeze. "Mark my words, that woman's going to get herself killed. That horse is dangerous, probably diseased too. When it happens, don't come crying to me about lawsuits." But the horse showed no signs of aggression. If anything, it seemed to be protecting Cordelia, positioning itself between her and the curious onlookers who had gathered to witness the spectacle. When a group of teenagers tried to approach for a closer look, the animal stepped forward slightly, not threatening, but clearly establishing boundaries. Cordelia had named him Valor during the short trailer ride to her temporary home, a friend's abandoned barn on the outskirts of town. As she led him into the ramshackle structure, she wondered if she'd finally lost her mind completely. The barn barely kept the rain out, her bank account was empty, and winter was coming fast. But as she watched Valor explore his new surroundings, she noticed something that made her catch her breath. Beneath the matted coat and accumulated grime, she could see the ghost of something magnificent. The way he carried himself despite his condition, the intelligent alertness in his eyes, the perfect proportion of his build. This wasn't just any horse. That night, while Valor dozed in the corner stall she'd hastily prepared, Cordelia sat on an overturned bucket with her late husband's laptop, determined to solve the mystery. She uploaded the photos she'd taken with her ancient phone and began searching through missing horse databases, stolen animal reports, and racing registries. 3 hours later, she found it. The photograph was 2 years old, showing a magnificent thoroughbred in peak condition, his coat gleaming like polished mahogany, his bearing regal and proud. The caption read, "Sovereign's Pride, winner of the 2023 Kentucky Derby qualifier, owned by Whitman Stables. Missing since transport trailer accident on Interstate 40. Reward offered." Cordelia's hands trembled as she read the details. 2 years ago, a trailer carrying 3 valuable horses had overturned during a storm. 2 horses had been found and returned to their owners, but the third, Sovereign's Pride, had vanished into the Tennessee mountains. The reward for his return was $50,000. She looked across the barn at the sleeping horse who had somehow found his way to her. $50,000 would solve every problem in her life. She could pay off her debts, find a real home, even reconnect with her estranged daughter who had cut contact when the medical bills from her husband's cancer treatment had destroyed the family finances. All she had to do was make one phone call. Instead, she closed the laptop and walked over to Valor's stall. He opened his eyes as she approached, and in them she saw not just intelligence but something else. Trust. Complete, absolute trust that she would do right by him. "Oh boy," she whispered, her voice catching. "What are we going to do?" The horse stood and came to the stall door, pressing his forehead against her chest in a gesture so gentle and trusting that tears began flowing down her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in his scent, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. In that moment, she understood why he had bowed to her at the auction. He hadn't been showing submission. He'd been showing recognition. Somehow, this magnificent creature had seen in her the one person who would choose his well-being over personal gain. The question was he right? Dawn broke gray and cold over the ramshackle barn, and with it came the sound of expensive vehicles pulling into the gravel driveway. Cordelia had been expecting this. Word traveled fast in a small town, especially when it involved embarrassing, powerful men like Beauregard Ashworth III. She stepped outside to find 3 black SUVs parked in formation, their occupants emerging, with the practiced efficiency of military personnel. The man who approached her wore a $1,000 suit that looked absurdly out of place in the rural setting, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the early hour. "Miss Whitmore, I'm Nathaniel Whitman of Whitman Stables." His voice carried the crisp authority of old money and older privilege. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Behind him stood 2 men who were clearly not horsemen. Their eyes constantly scanned the surroundings with the alertness of professional security. The third figure made Cordelia's heart sink. Dr. Quincy Blackwater, the county's only large animal veterinarian, carried a leather bag that undoubtedly contained tranquilizers. "I bought this horse fair and square at a legal auction," Cordelia said, positioning herself between the men and the barn door. "You have no right to—" "Ms. Whitmore, Whitman interrupted smoothly, producing an official-looking document from his jacket. This is a court order authorizing the immediate recovery of stolen property. The animal you purchased is Sovereign's Pride, a thoroughbred worth over $2 million. He was stolen from my property 2 years ago. Cordelia's mind raced. She'd spent the sleepless night researching not just the horse's history, but the circumstances of his disappearance. What she'd found painted a very different picture than the one Whitman was presenting. Stolen? She asked, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. Or did he escape after your transport driver fell asleep at the wheel doing a double shift? The accident report is public record, Mr. Whitman. So is the lawsuit filed by the other horse owners for neglect and endangerment. Whitman's composed expression flickered momentarily. The circumstances of the accident are irrelevant. The horse is mine, and I'm taking him back. From inside the barn came a sound that made everyone freeze. A deep, resonant whinny that spoke of alarm and defiance. Valor had heard the voices and recognized a threat. The barn door, which Cordelia had left slightly ajar, swung open as the horse pushed through. What emerged was not the broken-down animal from yesterday's auction. Overnight, Valor had transformed. His coat, while still dirty, now showed hints of its true color, a deep mahogany that caught the morning light like burnished copper. His head was high, his stance proud, and his eyes burned with an intelligence that made even the security men step back instinctively. But it was what happened next that changed everything. Valor walked directly to Cordelia and assumed the same position he'd taken at the auction, head bowed low in a gesture of respect and protection. Then he lifted his head and fixed his gaze on Whitman with an expression of such clear recognition and disdain that the wealthy man actually took a step backward. He remembers you, Cordelia said quietly. He remembers how you treated him. Doctor. Blackwater stepped forward with his tranquilizer gun, but Valor's response was immediate and dramatic. He reared up on his hind legs, his hooves cutting through the air inches from the veterinarian's head. It wasn't an attack. It was a warning, delivered with surgical precision that spoke of intelligence and training far beyond that of an ordinary horse. Jesus Christ! Blackwater stumbled backward, nearly falling. That animal's dangerous. No, Cordelia said, her hand finding Valor's neck as he settled back to all fours. He's protecting himself. And me. Whitman's composure finally cracked completely. I don't care what sob story you've concocted, old woman. That horse cost me a fortune. In stud fees alone, I've got breeding contracts worth millions riding on his bloodline. Breeding contracts, Cordelia repeated, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not the prize money he could win, but the money you could make forcing him to reproduce. How many mares were you planning? To breed him to each season? 30? 40? The look on Whitman's face confirmed her suspicions. She'd done her research thoroughly. Sovereign's Pride hadn't just been a racehorse. He'd been destined for a life of industrial breeding, confined to a stall, his magnificent spirit broken down to nothing more than genetic material. I have a court order, Whitman said through gritted teeth. Cordelia smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. Actually, you don't. That's a civil seizure warrant, which requires the presence of a law enforcement officer to be valid. I don't see any badges here, do you? The silence stretched taut as Whitman processed this development. His security men looked uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the legal gray area they'd wandered into. This isn't over, Whitman finally said, his voice cold with promise. I'll be back with proper authorities, and when I am, you'll discover that poverty provides very little protection against the law. As the SUVs disappeared down the gravel, Road? Cordelia turned to Valor, who was watching their departure with alert attention. Well, boy, she said softly. Looks like we're in this together now. The local news crew arrived first, followed by what seemed like half the county. By noon, Cordelia's borrowed barn had become the center of a media circus that stretched across 3 states. The story was irresistible. Elderly woman faces off against millionaire over rescued horse that may be worth a fortune. But the reality was far more complex than the sound bites suggested. Temperance McAllister, the sharp-eyed reporter from Channel 7, had done her homework. Her investigation had uncovered disturbing details about Whitman Stables' operations, USDA violations, anonymous complaints from employees, and a pattern of accidents involving high-value horses that had coincidentally occurred just before expensive insurance policies were set to expire. "This isn't just about one horse," McAllister explained to her cameraman as they set up for their live broadcast. "There's a whole network of illegal breeding operations, insurance fraud, and animal abuse. This old woman may have stumbled into something much bigger than she realizes." Inside the barn, Cordelia was struggling with a different kind of battle. News of the $50,000 reward had spread, and her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Her estranged daughter, Meadow, had called for the first time in 2 years, suddenly interested in reconciliation. Her landlord had appeared with eviction papers, then quickly changed his tune when he realized the potential value of his temporary tenant. Even the bank that had foreclosed on her ranch had sent a representative to discuss payment options. But it was the visit from Ashworth that truly tested her resolve. The cattle baron arrived alone this time, his usual entourage nowhere to be seen. He found Cordelia grooming Valor in the afternoon sun, the horse's true magnificence becoming more apparent with each stroke of the brush. "Cordelia," he said, using her first name for the first time in the 20 years they'd known each other. "I owe you an apology." She continued brushing, not trusting herself to speak. Ashworth had been one of her husband's closest friends before. The medical bills and foreclosure had made their social circle suddenly unavailable. "I was wrong yesterday. About you, about the horse. Hell, about a lot of things." He paused, his usual bluster replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. "Whitman came to see me this morning, made me an offer to buy your debt." "Force you to sell the horse to him." Cordelia's hand stilled on Valor's flank. "And?" "I told him to go to hell." Ashworth managed a rueful smile. "Took me 67 years to figure out that some things are worth more than money. Watching that horse bow to you yesterday." "That was something sacred, Cordelia, not something to be bought and sold." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air again. This time it was Sheriff Donnelly's patrol. Car followed by a convoy that included Whitman's SUVs, a horse trailer, and a van marked Federal Animal Recovery Unit. Whitman emerged with a satisfied smile and a handful of official documents. "Ms. Whitmore, this is a federal warrant for the recovery of stolen livestock. The FBI's Art and Antiquities Division handles high-value animal theft. You have 10 minutes to say goodbye." Cordelia felt the world spinning around her. Federal agents meant federal resources, lawyers she couldn't afford to fight, and consequences that could include criminal charges. But as she looked at Valor, who had positioned himself protectively between her and the approaching officials, she realized something profound. She'd rather face jail than betray this magnificent creature's trust. "No," she said quietly. "Ma'am?" Sheriff Donnelly approached with obvious reluctance. He'd known Cordelia for decades and clearly hated his role in this drama. "I said no." Her voice grew stronger. "This horse chose me, and I choose him. If you want him, you'll have to go through me. What happened next would become legend in their small county." Valor, as if understanding the gravity of the moment, walked forward and once again assumed his position of respect, head bowed low before Cordelia. But this time, something extraordinary occurred. From the crowd of onlookers that had gathered, an elderly man stepped forward. Then another. Then a woman Cordelia recognized from the grocery store. One by one, the people of the county began to form a protective circle around Cordelia and Valor. Ashworth was the first to join them. his massive frame making a clear statement about where he stood. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "I believe you'll find that investigating this warrant might take some time, federal paperwork being what it is." Sheriff Donnelly looked at the crowd, then at Whitman's increasingly frustrated expression, then at the horse, who seemed to understand exactly what was happening around him. "You know what, Mr. Whitman? I think Mr. Ashworth might be right. Better have my department's lawyers review this federal warrant real careful-like. Wouldn't want to make any mistakes." The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time since this all began, Cordelia felt like she might actually have a chance. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Harriet Vance, known throughout the state for her no-nonsense approach to justice, had agreed to hear the case after the media attention had made it impossible to ignore. The proceedings had drawn legal observers from across the country, all curious to see how the law would handle a case that seemed to exist in the gray area between property rights and something much more fundamental. Whitman had spared no expense, bringing in a team of lawyers from Nashville who filled 2 entire tables with documents, precedents, and evidence of ownership. Their case was straightforward. Sovereign's pride was valuable property that had been stolen, and regardless of the circumstances of his recovery, he must be returned to his legal owner. Cordelia sat at a small table with her court-appointed attorney, a young public defender named Brighton Castellanos, who had taken the case pro bono after seeing the media coverage. They had one advantage their opponents lacked: the truth. The breakthrough had come when Temperance McAllister's investigation uncovered Josiah Weatherby, the truck driver who had been transporting Sovereign's pride when the accident occurred. Weatherby had been living with guilt for 2 years, believing the horse had died in the wilderness after the crash. His testimony painted a devastating picture of Whitman's stable's operations. "Mr. Whitman ordered me to make that run despite the weather warnings," Weatherby testified, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, but he said the horse had to be at the breeding facility by midnight or he'd lose a $50,000 stud fee. When I started falling asleep at the wheel, I called to ask if I could stop for the night. He told me if I didn't deliver that horse on time, I'd never work in the industry again." But it was Dr. Blackwater's testimony that truly damned Whitman's case. Under oath, the veterinarian revealed that Sovereign's pride had been treated with illegal performance enhancers during his racing career and that his escape might have saved his life. The horse was showing signs of severe stress and cardiac irregularities, Blackwater admitted reluctantly. "I had recommended a 6-month recovery period, but Mr. Whitman insisted on maintaining the breeding schedule. In my professional opinion, continued stud service could have been fatal." When it came time for Cordelia to testify, she spoke simply and from the heart about the connection she'd felt with Valor from the moment she'd seen him at the auction. She described his condition, his remarkable recovery, and the trust he'd shown in her. "Your Honor," she concluded, "this isn't about money or ownership papers. It's about recognizing that some bonds transcend human law. Valor chose me, just as surely as I chose him. He's not property. He's a partner." Judge Vance had heard enough testimony to fill several trials, but it was what happened next that sealed the case. At the judge's request, Valor had been brought to the courthouse so she could observe his behavior firsthand. When Whitman approached the horse, Valor's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. He shied away, his eyes rolling white with fear and distress. But when Cordelia entered the courtroom, the transformation was magical. Valor walked directly to her, pressed his forehead against her chest, and then turned to face the judge with calm dignity. "In 40 years on the bench," Judge Vance said quietly, "I have never witnessed such a clear demonstration of preference from an animal. While the law recognizes horses as property, it also recognizes the principle of abandonment. Mr. Whitman, by your own admission, you made no serious effort to locate this animal for 2 years. You filed no missing animal reports with local authorities, posted no reward notices, and conducted no search operations. She paused, her gaze moving between Whitman's legal team and the small table where Cordelia sat beside her young attorney. Furthermore, the evidence suggests that returning this animal to your custody would constitute a form of abuse, given his documented health issues and your stated intention to continue using him for breeding purposes against veterinary advice. The courtroom held its breath. Therefore, this court finds that the plaintiff has abandoned any legal claim to the animal in question. Custody is awarded to Cordelia Whitmore, with the stipulation that the horse receive appropriate veterinary care and living conditions. The eruption of cheers from the gallery was so loud that Judge Vance had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order, but Cordelia barely heard it. She was looking at Valor, who seemed to understand that something momentous had just occurred. For the third time, he bowed his magnificent head to her, and this time she bowed back. 6 months later, the morning mist was just lifting from the pastures of Whitmore Sanctuary when Cordelia stepped onto the porch of her new home with her coffee. The reward money from Whitman's insurance company, paid after the FBI investigation uncovered evidence of fraud, had been enough to purchase a small farm just outside town. Valor grazed peacefully in the near pasture, his coat now gleaming with health, his spirit fully restored. He was not alone. 3 other horses that had been rescued from similar situations shared his domain, part of a sanctuary that had grown from one woman's act of faith into a beacon of hope for abused and abandoned animals. Meadow was coming for lunch today, their relationship slowly healing after years of silence. Ashworth stopped by most mornings to help with the heavy work, his gruff exterior hiding a heart that had finally learned the difference between price and value. As if sensing her thoughts, Valor lifted his head from his grazing and looked toward the porch. Even at this distance, she could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the same recognition that had passed between them at the auction so many months ago. She raised her coffee cup in a silent salute, and the magnificent horse tossed, his head in response before returning to his breakfast. They had both found what they were looking for, not in the dramatic moments that had made the news, but in the quiet daily choice to honor the trust between them. Some bonds, Cordelia reflected, truly did transcend human law. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, those bonds transformed not just your life, but your very understanding of what it meant to be alive in this world.